Right, good afternoon. From the Farm Consultancy Group, Mastergen and DBL, we'd like to jointly welcome you to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. This is our third webinar about dairy farming around the world. Today, Andrew Jones, who is a technical sales specialist for DBL, will be speaking about dairy farming in tropical Australia. Andrew was born and raised on a dairy farm in the Frome district in Somerset, before moving to Australia with his parents. More about that soon. Since returning, Andrew has qualified as a ruminant nutritionist by gaining a diploma from Harper Adams University, as well as becoming a licensed cow signals master, and is also on the Register of Mobility Scorers, ROMS. But more important, he is passionate about dairy farming, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy his talk today. After Andrew's talk, there will be time for questions, so please feel free to add them as we go along. And then just a note before we start, these talks are meant to be fun and are how we individually remember things. So please enjoy the talk, and over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Neil, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us if you're here with us live today, and thank you for those that might be watching this later on video at a later date. As Neil mentioned, these are just supposed to be a bit of fun and are simply my memories and experiences of my time in tropical Australia. So let's start. Just to give you a bit of a background of where I came from, as Neil said, grew up on a dairy farm near Frome. This was the particulars when the property was sold back in 1997. And it's farming about 300 acres, owned about 200, 100 was rented. Not quite 1 million litres of milk quota, 150 cows, calving all year round, supplying Wyke Farms. And then also we had 21,000 broiler chickens supplying Webb's Country Foods. So just give you a little bit of an idea of my background, to show you where it was. I apologise that the map's not the best. There's this blue dot here. Frome is over here. Radstock is over here. And just as a couple of interesting points, Bobster Quarry's there, which is now a diving centre that I've since learned to scuba dive in. And many of you may have heard of Babington House, which is here, which is where the likes of Zoe Ball, etc., have got married, and it's literally a stone's throw away, as you'll see. Just overall aerial view, there's the farm as it was, so chicken houses there on the right, the house, farm buildings, I should say. Since it's been sold, this is all now gone. The chicken sheds are now tennis courts. All the modern buildings are gone and are now croquet lawns. But the funniest one of all is the dirty water lagoon down here on the left is now a boating lake on the farm. That's Babington House just there in the background. And then the picture on the right, the blue outline was the home block. So that's about 140 odd acres in the blue. There was 60 acres away, 3 miles away, and the red patch was some of the rented land closer to home. And obviously there's a more close up of Bobster Quarry. Anyway, when my parents sold in 1997, I had to go over with them and trigger my visa and came back. And when I left them in Australia, which was about October 1997, I gave them one clear message, which was, do not buy anything. As you can probably understand, I was a bit nervous about what might happen without me being there. But anyway, come about April, May 1997, I get a phone call and was told we've just brought this property before it went to auction. So it was Walpooley Farms up in Millamilla, as it describes it, the heart of the Atherton Tablelands. Now, just to show you where that is, map of Australia, the blue dot there where my arrow is that was Millamilla. So for those that don't know, it's in the tropics of Capricorn. The equator would be just above here, above Papua New Guinea, and the tropic line would be somewhere around here. So we're right in the tropics, up in what they call far north Queensland. or more locally sometimes known as F&Q. But just to give you a little bit more closer view, Cairns is up there, which most people are aware of. Innisfail is down here, and we were inland around there, where that marker is in Millimiller. So this was in the tropics. It had previously been tropical rainforest, as I'll explain a little bit more. And then, just to give you a bit of a guide, this was then basically the particulars of the property when it was sold. So it gives you a little bit more about it. So yeah, it's not really a lot to say, just tells you what facilities, tells you type of pasture, there was some irrigation on the property, etc., etc. So just to give you an overview of it, this is obviously a map overview of the property. The blue line was the original 1,000 acres of the property, over about 7 titles. You can see the different laneways across the property. The main house was there, the original dairy was there, and we later built another dairy there on what was the local airstrip for the area. The previous owner had stopped people using it, but it was apparently a great airstrip, because as you came off the end here, the land just disappeared and people used to seed and fertilize from the air. The red patch about 40 acres, I think it was, maybe a little bit more, that a neighbour had built a property on, and then the green, sorry, I clicked too soon, the green was 150 acres we brought a little bit later. So Millimiller, what can we tell you about Millimiller? Well, it was only founded in approximately 1908, and obviously my computer doesn't like this. So it only been founded not even 100 years by the time we moved to the property. Its elevation was 830 meters, or 2,700 feet above sea level. At the time I was there, it only had a population of about 400 people, and it was part of Eacham Vale Shire, which approximately only had 5,500 people. Now, to give you an indication, I looked it up yesterday, Eacham Vale Shire in land area is about the quarter of the size of Somerset, and yet there was only 5,500 people across the whole region. Its main industry was dairy. Previously, it's a major industry there had been logging, because obviously it was rainforest, it had been virgin rainforest until the beginning of the 20th century. It was famous for its waterfall circuit. There on the right-hand side is a picture of Millimiller Falls. This was one of several immediately around Miller. And for those that you'd remember her, Jill Dando swam in this about a year before she died. The holiday program on what used to be the holiday program on the BBC used to like going there every time they came to North Queensland. Anyway, so moving on, its average rainfall, and you may have noticed that before, its average rainfall was 103 inches, and that is correct, 103 inches. The first 2 years we were there, they were the wettest wet seasons for a generation, and we had over 200 inches of rain each year. You did read that correctly, hear that correctly. And then in 2003, we had a drought of only approximately 60 inches. Now you might think, that's a drought. Trust me, up there it was. When I first was moving to the area, I'd been told that the soil depth was 30 to 40 feet of topsoil, but when I got there, I was corrected and told there was 30 to 40 meters of volcanic topsoil. So really, it did need the rain. Now, I mentioned the fact that we'd had 200 inches. Well, I say I think the first year we were there, we had 220 inches, but that is fairly insignificant. The area, or the North Queensland, hold a golden boot competition every year, and yeah, just basically who got the wettest who was the wettest that year. Now, the area that won, and it didn't, well, the area that was the wettest never won because it wasn't actually a township, but on wet years, an area called Topaz could actually get 335 inches of rain, so 8.5 meters of rain. So just to give you an indication of the effect that had, the first year I was there during that wet season, which was usually February through to about May, we had a cyclone come through, Tropical Cyclone Rona, which when I looked it up is actually 23 years ago today, so the 11th of February 1998. This was one of our creek crossings, or the major creek crossing on the property, which one of the herds had to go and graze some grazing blocks. As a matter of interest, there was a pool on the left where I was incredibly lucky to see some wild platypus ducks occasionally, which is a very rare thing to see. But this next photo was taken midday, the first day of that cyclone coming through. And as you can see, the water is quite deep. If we hadn't got these cattle at that particular time, I don't think we would have got them for a few days. Now, for anybody that doesn't know me, I'm 6'6". It probably doesn't look that deep, but if you look at some of the cattle just ahead of me, they're in a slightly deeper part of it, part of the creek. But yes, so that first day, the rain gauge only held 10 inches and I emptied it mid or end of the day or whenever it was. And yeah, we certainly had over 20 inches the first day, 12 the next. So we certainly had a minimum of 32 inches in 2 days. Funny thing was, a week later, apart from some washed down fences, you'd never known we'd had it because it had gone down, because the topography had gone down the coast and flooded the coast out. So definitely an experience of watching the water rise in front of your eyes. So just to give you an idea of the milk suppliers up there, when we, and some processors up there and how big an area it was, when we arrived in 1998, there were approximately 200 dairy farms in the area. It was considered to be the biggest tropical dairy region in the world. At the time, it was producing about 120 million litres, and the only processor, there was only one processor up there, and at that time, that was the Dairy Farmers Cooperative, which has recently been taken over through different ownership by Bega. Prior to that, it was Malanda Milk. They used to hold the world record for the longest milk run in the world. They used to supply fresh milk from there over to Darwin, which was about 1,400 miles. And there's even stories in the visitor centre when you had Cyclone Tracy hit Darwin in 1974, they hired airplanes and literally parachuted in fresh milk for babies and mothers into Darwin that had come out of this factory. Now, when we left in 2004, there was only 100 producers. I had an update recently from friends up there that tell me there's now only 42 farms producing 43 million litres. These days, the majority is for liquid milk, flavoured milk, some cream and a little butter. Milk is now sold in an area from Cape York in the north to Mackay in the south and Mount Isa in the west. On top of this now, there is a second producer, Mungali Creek Dairy, which are biodynamic. For those that don't know anything about biodynamic, the best way I can describe it is organic plus. And they now have 9 farms producing 4 million litres. And these products include milk, cheese, cream, yogurt, ice cream, and it's sold all over the eastern seaboard of Australia. Now, I remember these guys setting up because they were neighbours of ours. And they literally, it was 2 brothers, banks wouldn't lend them any money. Any spare cash they had, they built a small factory producing soft cheeses like Quark, etc., on the side of one of the brothers' houses. Move on 20 years, and they've recently opened a $3 million factory to further expand production. So it shows that with a little bit of perseverance and dreaming and hard work, things can be achieved. So just to talk about the kind of grasses that you can find on the property. Tropical grasses, ryegrass didn't grow through majority of the season. So you had Soteria, Brachiaria, and Kikuya or Pike. The main milking platform was Soteria. And you have to learn to graze tropical grasses differently. It was something I certainly had to do. Just as an example, we'd be used to grazing ryegrass. Ryegrass, you might go in at 4-6 inches and come out about 2 inches if it's been, grazed effectively. Soteria, you probably went in at 12 to 18 inches and pulled the cows out at 6 to 8 inches. Well, that was your ideal. I mean, we had basically day paddocks that were enough for one grazing and out, but that's what you were aiming for. If it got any tighter, it let the weeds in too much. Now, the other thing about these tropical grasses is once it gets below 15 degrees, they just stop growing. That's it. So then we did have 40 acres of solid set irrigation. You can see the post there. You'd probably say, why do we need irrigation when we had so much rainfall? The answer was we got dry during the winter months, so June, July, August, and then to make the most of it, we grew ryegrass. So we had about 40 acres of ryegrass, which you plant as soon as the wet season was finished, May time, start grazing it June, late June. And by the time you got to September, October, it disappeared. The tropicals had come back and just out-competed it, and it was gone. So it was definitely a different experience learning to graze in North Queensland. Then some of the things we had to deal with, ticks. This is one of the first meetings I went to, was a meeting about ticks, and learned that ticks respond to CO2. Also used to love fern trees. So I was told that ticks love hiding in fern trees, for those that know what I'm referring to. But you had the bush tick, the cattle tick, and the paralysis tick. The paralysis tick, as the name suggests, will cause paralysis in dogs and calves to the point it would actually kill them if you weren't treated. And often if they had been hit with a paralysis tick, I think the vet said to me one time, it affects the heart valves, so the animal was never quite right. So a little bit of a nasty to worry about. Now, ticks, you had your tick season, which was about July to June. Now, life cycle of a tick is 3 weeks. So you have to treat or go through a cycle of treating those animals every 3 weeks to combat the ticks. Now, also you had a tick vaccine. This was made, I believe, from horse blood. This was done twice a year. This was, everything stopped basically to do that. The vets rang out, said, how many doses do you want? You ordered it, you had to collect it in a cool box and use it within 24 hours. So when it came, you used it. But after that, the other treatments ones during the season was a poron, which was Cydectin, which obviously the cost meant you were only getting back what you paid. You could do a plunge dip or a spray race. So I'm going to show you some pictures I've never shown anyone else before, which is some animals going through a plunge dip. So this is basically a full-size sheep dip, but for cattle, with a shed. And as you can see, they had to come in, jump, land, and then work their way out again, and away you went. So you had to do this every 3 weeks. First year we were there, we only did the in-calf heifers and bulling heifers through the plunge dip. The previous owners put milkers through there, but there was risks of abortion, etc., etc. So it used to take us a week of every 3 weeks that first year to control the ticks, because we were using Cydectin on all the younger animals and also all the milkers. So later on, when we built a new dairy, we built a spray race. Now that's the spray race we built on the left. And just an example, I found a picture on the internet on the right of what a spray race actually looks like, what it's going. But basically, you really want high volume, low pressure, and they just walk through that, immerse them or cover them in 360 degrees to cover them with a chemical to help the ticks. Now, ticks, just to give you an idea, in Australia, that's the map of Queensland. That line there is the tick border. If you want to come south of that tick border, you have to go through a plunge dip about 5 days before you get to the border. You get to the border, and you have to be inspected at the border. If you're clean, as in no sign of ticks, you get plunged again, then you're allowed to move on. If you're dirty, you got plunged again, expelled for 5 days, inspected again, and the whole process again. Have to be clean, etc. If it was you were going up the other way, you were definitely a good idea to vaccinate for tick fever. Then the good one, snakes. So these were the three most common in the area: the carpet python, the red-bellied black, and the taipan. Carpet pythons, not poisonous, but had a strong bite. You did see them around. The red-bellied black was poisonous, but there've never been a recorded death from them. Certainly did see them around. I've got to be honest, anytime I saw them with a quad bike, I'd lift my legs as high as possible and drive over them when they're on the laneways. Bit daft, really, but I just wasn't a fan of snakes. Taipans, didn't particularly see them up where we were because it was too wet, but they were down on the coast near Cairns. And they are considered to be about the second most deadly snake in the world. And there's only ever been one recorded recovery from a snake bite from a taipan without using an anti-venom. So it shows you how dangerous they are. And we certainly had lost cattle from them in the past. Cane toads were up there, not a big problem to us as such, but they were up there. They were introduced to combat beetles at the top of sugarcane after success of doing similar in the likes of Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Hawaii. So in 1935, 100 or so were introduced near Cairns, and to be honest, it was a complete failure. The beetle lived at the top of the sugarcane. The cane toad lived on the ground. It decided they were better and easier prey. So it's had a massive effect on local biodiversity in Australia because it is poisonous. There are poison glands on the back of it. So it has no predator because of it. So just to give you an example of the effect it has, this is the front page of a paper, a local paper from a town in the Northern Territory. And this was their headline, that they're here. And they were really worried about when they hit the world famous kakadu and the effect it will have. I mean, as an example, the equivalent of Radio 1 over there, Triple J, I remember when they were first found in the Northern Territory, ran a piece basically saying, okay, Queenslanders, they've hit the Northern Territory, how should we get rid of them? And the honest answer is the humane way to them is to put them in a freezer and freeze them. But I knew people that used to play golf with them, cricket with them, go out with an aerosol can and lighter and go and burn them. They were so prolific the first year, a couple of years we were there, you couldn't go anywhere without running over them, and you just hear this pop, 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 pop as you ran over them, and they popped. But I think after the first couple of wet seasons, I wonder if the spawn got washed away, but they are considered a massive problem, certainly in Northern Australia. Other thing, we saw leeches. You couldn't go anywhere without leeches. It was great fun bringing the cows in after, and they were covered in leeches and all these engorged leeches falling on the yard, and you just walk around and pop them all open, but oh well. And the next thing, now this was the first thing I was actually ever told about when I got there, stinging trees. Now, you might say, okay, stinging trees, right. Now, stinging tree, I've since learned, is from the same family as the stinging nettle, which is not in Australia, but in the south of Australia, they do have what we would call dead nettle. Now, this was the first thing I was told about, and told if you ever see one, don't touch it, don't go anywhere near it, let someone know and poison it. And there was always a bottle of poison made up ready to poison the stinging tree. They have little hairs made of mineral silica on them. If you get in them, there is which then inject the poison into you, and there is no antidote to this. And these were in the patches of rainforest that were still on the property. the stories of an army camp at the end of our roads during the Second World War, and an American went out to relieve himself at night, needed something to wipe himself with, grabbed a leaf, didn't think anything of it, wiped himself with it, and yeah, story is he went and took a gun and shot himself and killed himself because he just couldn't cope with the pain. It will go, I'm read since it will go on for months. So not the most pleasant thing to worry about. So as you can see, there's quite a few interesting flora and fauna to avoid or be careful of when we were up there. In terms of the feed that was available, I mean, we had our own miller mix to start with, but then we brought in pellets or feed concentrate. Our main protein source when we were miller mixing our own was cottonseed meal. But if you wanted to buy bulk feed, you had the whole cottonseed, which came out of central Queensland, and the transport costs were quite horrific just to get it up there. You had the gas, which is basically what's left over from sugarcane after they've processed that. I did once say, why can't we feed green chop sugarcane? But apparently it's got quite high in silica. Or peanut hay. Now, for anybody that's not seen peanut hay, the best way I think to describe it is it looks like the hedgerow cuttings of someone gone along with a hedge trimmer being brushed up and put in front of the cows. Cows absolutely loved it. Couldn't get enough of it if you put it in front of them. Now, these sorts of feeds, really, we only fed during the wet season, for that sort of February through to May, these bulk sort of feeds. And the other one that was readily available, obviously, because the sugarcane factories were only an hour down the road, was molasses. Molasses was as cheap as chips. You could feed that quite happily. So a lot of farms had ad-lib molasses, stainless steel trough. Molasses was just pumped into it constantly, and then you dropped your concentrate on top. And that's what we had initially in the original dairy. Then just to move on, a few photos from our time up there. As I say, we built originally there was a 16 swing over herringbone on the farm, and we ended up, because that was the farm was 300 cows when we got there, and we took it up to 600 cows. We built a 50-point rotary, so just a picture of the rotary. On the left, on the right was the shed, so the rotary was in the shed there on the left, and your feed shed was there on the right, and it was big enough that you could reverse in a walking floor for the cottonseed, and it could just dump it in there and go. I mean, when it got to wet season, they could eat potentially about 5 kilos of whole cottonseed a day per head, so obviously quite a bit. Just to show you, I did actually milk cows. There's me on cuts on the rotary, and then on the right is a flood wash tank. There's no, like as we'd be used to in this country, tractors and scrapers to clean the yard. It was all flood wash. Everything went in. All your waste water went from the middle of the rotary, then went into the flood wash tank. Milking had finished. You open the flood wash tank, direct it with the valve that was on there, and it would clean your yard. Job done within about 2 minutes, and that was the end of it, and then it was obviously all recycled around again. Sorry, this was a picture of some calves on slats. There was no straw or bedding available up in North Queensland, so someone years prior developed these calf pens that were about, I don't know, 2 foot off the ground, with slats, and the calves were raised like that until they were weaned, and then they went out. I mean, somebody was updating the idea as we left, and we're using a plastic mesh on the bottom rather than these slats, because occasionally calves' legs would get stuck in them. But otherwise, that was standard, gave a good airflow and circulation around, because obviously it was a very humid at different times. Just a couple of views from our time there. On the left is the old dairy and loading ramp that was there when we first got there. To your right is just a view out across from a similar position. The one on the left is the view of the dam when it was full. You can see there at the back on the right of that picture was the new dairy complex. You might just be able to make the roof out just in front from the main homestead. The picture on the right, now this was the picture I used at the start of the presentation. This is actually my view from cuts on when it wasn't raining and the doors were open on the rotary, and I had to sit there, or stand there I should say, at times remind myself I probably had the best view in the world for milking cows. It was absolutely beautiful. This is actually Mount Bartle Freer, which is the highest mountain in Queensland, at about 1,611 meters or 5,285 feet. And so, yeah, I literally cuts on, you had a laneway, you had those paddocks, you had rainforest, and then you had Mount Bartle Freer in the background. And what could be better? When it was a beautiful day, it was stunning. Yeah, I don't think you can beat it. Just a couple of other views from the property. That was from the other end of the farm, mainly where the heifers were. The one on the right is just a view looking back towards the dairy. That one then is a picture neighbour sent me, an old neighbour sent me recently, looking back towards our property from theirs. So where my arrow is now, that was some of our dry cow paddocks. Sometimes I don't know how they got tractors in some of these places to put the fence posts in. I really don't know. But so that was looking back on our property. And then this was the view from Miller Lookout. So looking out across, obviously, what would have 100 years prior just all been rainforest. So yeah. So really, other than that, I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say. I'd like to thank my friends James and Sari Garrity, who sent me that picture and updated me with that information about where things are at the moment. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you, Andrew. That was tremendous. What a beautiful farm. Yeah, I have a couple of quite a few questions here. First one is, what does Miller stand for? What does it mean?
I was always told, I've read differently the last few days and I've been looking it up, but I was always told in Aboriginal, because obviously a more famous place is Wagga Wagga, if you repeat the name, it means lots of or plenty of. And I was always told that Miller means in the local dialect, because let's be honest, there was hundreds of local dialects around Australia. Miller meant wet. So basically Miller, lots of wet or much wet. Which is, I think you can probably tell, that much rainfall, wet, it definitely was at certain times of year. So yeah, that's what I was always told it meant.
And then second one is what do you reckon is the biggest difference between dairy farming in Western Australia and dairy farming in England?
Do you mean in North Queensland?
Yeah, I mean in North Queensland, sorry. Yeah.
That's a good question. You certainly didn't get the production levels, or we certainly didn't. There were one or two people doing it, so you certainly wouldn't do that. There wasn't feed available. There wasn't probably the services available that we would here, because obviously it was, a smaller market, should we say, in terms of farms. That's a good one. The grasses were different, the things you had to deal with, the ticks, etc. I don't know. There's so much there, I would say, with the differences between here and there. I mean, hopefully I highlighted some of them. You'd say, oh, the weather was good, but people think of that, okay, we didn't get frosts, but we probably hit, mid-30s, but the humidity was quite tremendous at times. Yeah, just some, and then the wet season, there's stories of people in Miller in the 1930s, I think it was, not seeing the sun for 9 months. And I can quite easily believe that, because often I didn't get out our road for sometimes months at a time. And, you just didn't, when it was the wet season, you just didn't see that sun. It's quite an experience. So I don't know, there's just so much, it's all the same but all different, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hopefully I've given some hint of what that was like.
Yeah. And then we were speaking about cane toads, and obviously there's a lot of spiders. Do they have any impact on your dairy cows, those cane toads? Could they poison your dairy cows?
I've never known cane toads affect the cows in any way. I think they probably kept well clear of each other. Snakes, I think, as I mentioned, we did lose one or two definitely to snakes in the past. I definitely remember one morning going to get the cows in the dark and finding an animal half in and half out of the dam. I got told since anything bitten by a snake usually heads for water, and later we couldn't save it, but you saw the bite marks on the brisket. I've not, ticks certainly affected your production if you didn't control them. It would pull your production down. I haven't mentioned spiders. We didn't have any real bad spiders up where we were, though just as a story, one wet season started, I can't remember, after I'd been there 3 or 4 years, and in the back of the shed was this spider, and it was huge. And this is no lie, its leg span was probably as big as your dinner plate. Its body was probably the size of a cigar, or something like that. I seem to remember it had sort of blue and orange sections to its body. It stayed there for a couple of days, and then we never saw it again. And I remember saying to the guy that was working for us, "You ever seen anything like that before?" No. And so don't know, but yeah, snakes, yes. Spiders, no. Ticks, yes. Cane toads, no.
Right. And then just looking at that photo, how did you obtain the world-renowned Noni cow? And tell us a little bit about the family.
The Nonis, yeah. I brought the Rudolph back when she was an 87.3-year-old. She and her dam was number 1 and number 2 in Australia, and I think she was about number 8. It was a guy from southeast Queensland, thankfully in a tick area, had bred the family. They got to the top of the Australian rankings. He'd never sold one before, and through a mutual contact, our local CMEX rep actually, he sort of asked, would he be willing to sell one? And we sort of, a little bit. I remember going down to see him, and he went through, and it was this all brown, and you went over this rise of a hill into where his little valley where his farm was, and there's this little green oasis, because they certainly worked the land very well with the bit of irrigation they had. And I know we just started talking and managed and hit it off, and he was happy to sell. First time he'd sold a member of the family. And so I brought the Rudolph, brought her up to North Queensland. Say didn't get the level of production that we would have elsewhere, but she was good enough, and whatever, it created interest. The Morty was the result of a flush that was contracted with CMEX. Her full brother went to CMEX, the only bull I ever sold on a royalty contract, and he wouldn't produce any semen, so that was that, as they say. And then I inseminated her to Shottle, and she had the Shottle. Obviously I didn't realize it at the time, but she's the oldest milking Shottle in Australia, who's obviously gone on to done lots of good things for me, and then obviously for subsequent owners. And I know recently, was it Australian Cow of the Year at 14.5. But after I sold her, she was leading genomic cow in Australia, and I think her Oman daughter was even higher. And yeah, it was, I got into it. If I was going to milk cows, I might milk good cows, and I brought 1 or 2 local families, and then brought into Noni, and it went from there.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, that's absolutely super. And then just final one I've got here is tell us more about Cyclone Rona.
What an experience that was. Yeah, I certainly remember that morning going out to go and get the dry cows and thinking, oh, it's just raining. And you literally saw the creeks raise above you. I mean, to be honest, by the time it hit us, it was more a rain depression. But looking back at the information on it, It hit the coast apparently about 80 miles an hour, and is recorded as this information I found out looking back just recently. It's the second wettest tropical cyclone on record. Mount Ellenden Kerr, which is the second highest peak in Queensland, and right next door to Bartlefree, I've already mentioned, recorded 1,870 millimeters or 73.6 inches due to that. And because of that and the effect it had, the name Rona has now been retired from the cyclone list. And it was, I don't know how to explain it. It's just trying to tell somebody that what would we here would expect as maybe our average rainfall for the year fell in 2 days. It's hard to explain. And to say, if we hadn't got those cows back when we had, we wouldn't have got them back for a couple of days because it just would have been too deep and the amount of water was too much. But a week later, it all gone down the coast, flooded them out, and we'd had some broken fences. I mean, I talk about the amount of rain. There was an old character up in there who used to say that there was an effing drought if we hadn't had rain for 3 days. And you did need that rainfall because of the amount of soil I mentioned, but when you get it in a big hit like that, it was definitely an experience.
Excellent. If there are no other questions, thank you, Andrew. That was absolutely brilliant. What an incredible insight to. I just love listening to people speak passionately about dairy farming, but also just explaining to us what they've seen and how things differ in other countries. And that's absolutely fantastic. So thanks very much for that. With that, anything else to add?
No, other than thank you very much for everybody for joining us, and not just for this, but for the previous two as well. I hope you've enjoyed these insights that Neil, Mark, and myself have provided you with what we've experienced around the world, and hope you've enjoyed.
Thank you. Goodbye.